Welcome back, folks. First, I wanted to share that Mayor Emanuel unfortunately had an emergency in the city and sends his regrets and will not be able to join us. But we are now ready to kick off the plenary discussion. At yesterday's plenary, we talked about the role of philanthropy in society and the markets and how impact investing fits in. There were some real fireworks, and we actually trended #1 on Twitter in all of Chicago. Today, we're going to dig deeper into the unique leadership role of foundations in the impact investing market. We're going to talk about the power of catalytic capital. We're going to hear concrete examples from leading foundations about how they are providing patient and flexible capital to catalyze innovative new deals across the U.S. and the globe. Some of these examples they will share were announced just this week. I am pleased to have Julia Stash back on stage to provide some introductory remarks to frame the discussion. She will be joined by 4 foundation presidents: Carol Larson of the David and Lucille Packard Foundation, Christine Marquez Hudson from Denver Foundation, Rip Rapson of the Kresge Foundation, and Raj Shah from the Rockefeller Foundation. Julie, come on up.
Well, I'm back, and welcome to the second plenary, and I have to let you in on a little secret. My fellow panelists here are anxious. They're all saying, how can we be provocative? How can we do fireworks when all we're talking about is what we're doing? And so the plenary yesterday was provocative questions about whether or not we should do impact investing. So the fact is that this panel stipulates yes, we do impact investing, but the next almost hour is about catalytic capital and how some of the leaders in the impact investing field are working to expand the flow of this resource. So what is catalytic capital? Sounds to me like jargon, but no. Actually, catalytic capital is simply loans, investments, and guarantees that are more flexible, more patient, more risk tolerant, and maybe a lower return than a typical commercial investment can be. Now, we refer to this kind of capital as catalytic because most importantly, it's additive. This is but-for capital. It enables leverage and supports impact that would not otherwise be possible. Now, to be clear, many of you know catalytic capital is not new. Most program-related investments would fall into this category, and of course, foundations have been providing this kind of financing for decades. But still, catalytic capital is not really studied or not fully understood. In fact, there are just a handful of reports about it from the GIN and from Omidyar. But there's a good framework for this conversation in the book called The Impact Investor. It outlines 4 core purposes for catalytic capital: seeding, sustaining, de-risking, and signaling. And I would add a 5th, scaling. Now, of course, sometimes an investment can have several of these attributes, sometimes just one. But let's get concrete. That's the purpose of this panel. One of my favorite examples is Self-Help Federal Credit Union and its rescue of a failed community bank here in Chicago. Self-Help is a CDFI that MacArthur and Ford and others have invested in for many years because of its success providing financial products to underserved communities. When it intervened to revive Second Federal, which was a long-standing pillar of Chicago's Latino community, MacArthur provided a large PRI to support the work and the rapid growth involved in taking over a large portfolio of very troubled loans. Now, I like this example because the impact was immediate and clear. Hundreds of families that were at risk for foreclosure stayed in their homes. Second Federal now serves a growing group of individuals who are credit union members, and they provide a full range of financial products to immigrants, to low and moderate income families, and first-time homebuyers that might otherwise not have access to capital. So this is catalytic capital at work. Leveraging, connecting, and paving the way. These are attributes that are often missed in an analysis of risk and return. Now, keep in mind that, of course, catalytic capital doesn't exist in opposition to other forms of investing. Often it makes possible the flow of other forms of capital, and it helps connect the dots. Now, of course, for catalytic capital to grow, we need examples of its power. We need to see the wide variety of ways it can be used. We need lessons from its successes and its failure, and that's what this panel is going to do. This panel begins that dialogue, and so let me join 4 terrific leaders in the field to hear from them about their experimentation, their aspirations, and their lessons. So you've already been introduced. If you want to know more, click the button on the app because their full bios are there. But let's start out with, let's just set the stage a little bit. How do you think about impact investing in the institution that you lead, and where does catalytic capital fit into that? Carol, let me start with you.
Great, good. So I'm with the Packard Foundation, and we're a 53-year-old family foundation. We have always viewed, for a long time, for 30 years now, viewed the role of PRIs and mission investments, catalytic capital, as an important tool in what we have available to advance our mission. We have a strong focus on climate change, on reproductive health and rights, and on early childhood. And since the beginning of our foundation, I think we've made over $780 million in mission investments over the 30 years or so. But definitely the attributes you talked about, Julie, we put at the front. You know, our board and our staff, Susan Finney-Silver is here, and others, have really emphasized from the beginning, we're about impact first. So we want to take risks, we want to be signaling new opportunities, we want to be proving concept, but we're about impact first. So how do we institutionalize that? We really work closely with our program directors. So basically, we view it as a tool aiding our grant making. Often these deals are really involving both grants and catalytic capital. We have that partnership between our mission investment staff and programs. And we also really keep that eye on mission at the center, which I love that that's the theme of this conference.
Rip, what about you? You wanted to be provocative and fireworks. Yeah.
Well,
give it a try.
Oh, yeah.
I spent the morning with Larry Kramer kind of getting instruction, but I don't, didn't work so well. You know, Kresge is based in Detroit, has a 100-year history, has been a fairly traditional grant maker for much of that time. And about a decade or so ago, we tried to sort of move in a sort of an intentional pivot toward embracing the kind of work that Carol's just described. And we brought on Kimberly Cornett, who's here to sort of create a social investments practice. That practice began rather modestly with a set of fairly straightforward loans. And over the next 10 years, I mean, Kimberly has just sort of blown out all of the assumptions that we had to begin with. And so I think what has come to characterize her work and Kresge's broader work in the space is sort of almost a construct of reverse engineering. We're fairly clear about the programmatic impact we want to have in human services and the arts and in the environment and the rest, as well as our work in Detroit. And the question then becomes, what combination of capital helps catalyze? And that looks a little bit different in Detroit than it does in Oakland, but I think in every case, what we're increasingly committed to is trying to figure out sort of the best mix and the match to make sure that what at the end of the day you do is indeed both pursuant to mission, but also sort of enhances each part of the equation. I mean, a grant in combination with a loan in combination with a guarantee actually might be even more powerful than any one of those pieces. So I think what we're trying to figure out is sort of what is the right admixture by field, by place, by circumstance. And I think that's kind of our next horizon of work.
So Raj, talk a little bit about why but for is meaningful to you.
Well, I want to say something first about
Okay,
RIP4,
do it.
Because I'm from Detroit, and Rip and Darren Walker Ford and others did an extraordinary deal when Detroit was going through its bankruptcy to get Detroit through the bankruptcy and emerge on the other side in a more hopeful place. And my kind of theme, the thing I learned from that is if you can aggregate a lot of capital and be really aggressive about using it in its most catalytic form, to me, it doesn't actually matter if you call it mission-related investing or program-related investing or impact investing or grant making or just guaranteeing someone else's financial arrangement until they get through to a more creditworthy place. And I guess my message to this group would be, I think we need everyone in this room to be deeply, deeply committed to using whatever capital sources you have access to deliver big, profound results like that. And that's the bar that I think you should hold yourself to. At the Rockefeller Foundation, we have big goals. We've had them for a long, long time. One, our international work focuses on really the effort to end poverty and its consequences of poor health on a global basis and hunger and food insecurity. And domestically, we are refocusing our energies and our efforts on expanding economic mobility and access to jobs, particularly in those places that have been hardest hit over the last decade with a lack of opportunity. We can't even begin to solve those problems if we're not thinking about using all of our resources in a fundamentally catalytic way. So just to give you one example, we work in 100 cities around the world to help improve resilient infrastructure. And the costs of building out the infrastructure that those cities need as they absorb 2-3 billion additional people, everybody asks, well, where are the trillions of dollars going to come from? And we don't know the answer, but we have one specific project where we've said, okay, we have staff on the ground working with mayors in those cities. We have project design partners that can design infrastructure projects and put certain types of climate resilience planning into the design to take the risk down of the project. They can elevate the projects politically so that the political and regulatory risks can be mitigated. And all of that helps investors get projects done faster and money back sooner. So it creates real economic value and real opportunity. So we actually have a request for proposals out now in case there are any partners that want to work with us on creating a resilient urban infrastructure fund together with private equity firms that do infrastructure. And that would be a partnership between Rockefeller and PE firms, modeled after some other partnerships we've seen, like with the Nature Conservancy and others, where they engage directly with investors, bringing their expertise to optimize the way projects are designed and constructed. And as we go forward, again, I don't know whether necessarily what definition that's going to fall under, but if we can mobilize $750 or $1 billion and deploy it in concrete infrastructure projects that change the lives of people in rapidly growing cities at home and around the world, that would be a great thing. And it's a great way to use our market position and our capital together with private investors to create the kind of change we need to achieve our goals.
I bet somewhere in that whole stack is catalytic capital, the kind of patient capital, more custom, lower return.
Yes, and we call that, of course, PRI capital, program-related investment.
Someday our industry will get it straight. But Christine, let's hear from you not only what's happening at the Denver Foundation, but a little bit about your perspective on impact investing in the entire community foundation arena.
Sure. Well, the Denver Foundation is the largest and most established community foundation in the Rocky Mountain region. So we've been around for more than 90 years. We manage over $840 million in total assets. We have over 1,000 different charitable funds, and last year we gave out a total of $65 million in grants. So we really believe that catalytic impact investing for us is about leveraging those resources and leveraging those relationships that I think community foundations in general have in abundance and that are necessary to get some of these resources to those place-based areas. So our impact investing program really has three parts to it. We have an impact investing pool, which we utilize primarily to provide low-interest loans to all different types of projects that further our community grant-making areas. And those are economic opportunity, basic human needs, education, and leadership and equity. By the way, racial equity is a really important thing that we are trying to utilize these resources to further and advance and talk about a tall order, right? The second one is really co-investment, and I think that's unique to the community foundation world. We have all these relationships with fund holders who are interested in many, many different things, but a lot of their interests coincide with the areas of interest of the foundation. And so where are those projects where the foundation can be that curator of the opportunity, do the financial due diligence, do all the work to make that project accessible, and then invite fund holders in to direct their gifts or grants to that project. And the third is to really facilitate direct investments by our fund holders out of their donor-advised funds. And we're beginning to see more and more interest as this whole field develops nationally. Fund holders are expressing curiosity. We're providing some opportunities for them to experiment. And then as they become emboldened, they're bringing their own deals to the table. And we facilitate those by giving them access to legal assistance and to financial due diligence. So those are the three areas that are currently comprising our impact investing program and really furthering our mission, which is to inspire people and mobilize resources to strengthen our community. And I think as community foundations, we don't need to think of those resources as being isolated to only our community endowments. We have access to many more resources that we can engage in this effort.
So Raj started us off with a terrific example. Carol, talk a little bit about either a past catalytic capital investment or that you're excited about.
I want to make sure we talk about both the past and the future.
Yeah, do a little bit of past, but then we'll do the
You want
future.
me to later, future? Okay.
Future to come, yes.
Okay, all right, great. So I'll stick with the past. But it is a good, the example I said we really try to focus on where our impact investments hit with our mission. And one of our missions from 1964, when Dave and Lucille set up the foundation, was to make sure that women and men had access to quality contraceptives. And so over the decades, we've been very much focused on that. And you can imagine in the last decade, well, probably all of the decades, there are real challenges there. And so in 2010, a group came to us and said, the public health clinics and the Planned Parenthood clinics need a more reliable source of generic contraceptives to reduce cost and to make sure that there's access even as public policy changes around what's reimbursed and what isn't. And so we made a $4.5 million loan to a company called Afaxis and stayed with them. It took a little longer, 1% interest, took a little longer. We stayed with them even as they hit delays in the FDA approval process. And now we're totally repaid back, and Afaxis is the #1 provider of contraceptives to all the public health clinics and Planned Parenthood clinics in the country, and we think that's increasing the access. But I would say, just to underscore, we'll return to these points, is there it was a better use and better leverage of our dollars than if we'd done $4.5 million in grant dollars to them. You know, it really helped them get their business model together, get other investors down the line. And of course, we make lots of grants to those entities as well. But it really ended up being something we're very proud of for the leverage, the signaling, and real difference on the ground to women in terms, and men in terms of access to contraceptives.
That's a terrific example. Rip?
Well, I think I'm going to change my answer based on what Christine said. You know, there is a temptation, and I think we succumb to this fairly often, to assume that our institution needs to sort of provide the risk capital to something that then sort of takes off. But so often, I think what we've found in our practice is that our risk capital in combination with other investors becomes really powerful. I mean, just to thread in what Raj said, if you just looked at Detroit, for example, we were trying to figure out a way to sort of open up the pipeline of redevelopment in the midtown part of the city to kind of bring the market back. So we took off the first layer of risk, and lo and behold, both Prudential and MetLife came, neither of which had ever lent a dime into the city of Detroit, which in turn sort of drew in other partners. So it was sort of a classic co-investment. They're much more complicated, obviously. You've got to meet the capital stack needs of everyone. But at the end of the day, it was what not any one of those partners could have done. Similarly, we've just, in very recent history, entered into a sort of a co-investment with Steve and Connie Ballmer and with Prudential Financial to try to figure out how to create a pool that we hope will get up to the $75 or $100 million range that will pay for success kinds of pilots. I mean, we've got a bunch of pay for success pilots across the country, but I think they've been spotty, and it's not at all clear that there's been sort of a systematic and systemic way of looking at them. And our hope is that by investing in a fund, it's something called the Make Home Fund, that will actually have enough coherence to that fund so that we can pressure test different forms of pay for success. And that happens to coincide with some new federal legislation that appears to be encouraging this kind of undertaking. So if we could get some proof points out of that in the next number of years, I think that might be another good example of the kind of co-investment that Christine described.
Also nudge an arena in impact investing that's sort of stalled, I think, maybe.
Yeah.
Pay for success.
Yeah.
What are you thinking about looking back that you're proud of?
Well, we have a Pay for Success program that I think has been a real cornerstone of our impact investing work over the last several years. It's called the Social Impact Bond for Permanent Supportive Housing. And a quick shout out to some of our investor partners who are here in the room. Gary Community Investments and Northern Trust are two of the 8 other investors that were very important to this. And also to my colleague, Kate Lyda, who really spearheaded this for us at the foundation. We happen to be a small investor with an entity that really worked locally to craft the concept. Basically what this is a permanent supportive housing program for 250 of Denver's people who are experiencing homelessness, who were the highest users of the criminal justice system. They were in and out of jail for low-level offenses like panhandling or trespassing or things like that. And also, many of them had mental illness and substance abuse issues, and so they were also frequent users of the emergency medical system. Altogether, costing the city of Denver a lot, but equally important, they were chronically on the streets and suffering immensely from Colorado weather and those conditions, not to mention other safety issues. So the idea was to create a housing first model that would provide them with stable housing first, and then through that stable housing, they could access the comprehensive supportive services that they needed. And in the case of those individuals with mental illness and substance abuse issues, an integrative case management team that would work with them. We're 2 years out from that program, and the results have been really, really exciting. The Urban Institute is doing our evaluation, and the year 1 results had 89% of the participants staying in housing for a 12-month period. And we're just getting into the year 2 outcomes. And the financial results have been very promising as well. The city of Denver is so excited about the promising outcomes that they have decided to pay for 75 additional people to go through this program, and they're doing it on a performance-based contract. So I think that it was an $8.6 million total investment, $8.7 million total investment from these 8 investors. But those resources leveraged over, the whole project was about $25 million. And so that initial investment was able to leverage local and state housing voucher dollars, as well as Medicaid reimbursement dollars. And so I think that that's a great example of how we can come together and do this type of work. Specifically with the Denver Foundation, our investment of $500,000 not only brought in our own capital, but we were able to invite in our fund holders. And for as little as $10,000, they were able to participate in this project, which really allowed us to democratize the opportunity to be a part of this. So many of these bigger investments require such a high level of contribution that many community foundations couldn't do it on their own. Fund holders couldn't do it on their own. But together, we can pool those resources under the umbrella of a community foundation and be a part of something as high impact as a social impact bond like this.
But the beauty of it is that it really lets the fund holders feel close to the impact that they really hope for in their city. I think that's a wonderful benefit of community foundation and the donor advised fund particularly.
Yeah.
Now, Raj, when you talked about the resilient cities, the resilient infrastructure fund, talk just for a moment about the role of grants sort of paving the way for this.
Well, thank you. We have a portfolio called the Zero Gap portfolio that's really designed to use grant resources to design instruments like the ones you've heard about here that ultimately can attract commercial or impact investment capital in order to be able to close the gap between what it takes, what resources we have, and what it takes to achieve certain goals. An example of that is the Forest Resilience Bond, which, if we can reduce the risks of forest fires and save that downstream cost, you can create an instrument that people would then be able to invest in. We have an insurance product that I find very interesting in the Gulf of Mexico for those businesses, mostly tourist businesses and hotels that depend on the local coral reef being healthy and strong for their own livelihood, acquiring an insurance product and using those resources to maintain and support the quality of the reef. We're working to design a socially impact-oriented exchange-traded fund, an ETF, to see if we can use that instrument to attract more capital into those types of efforts. All of these are intended to be on the innovation frontier to test what might work, what otherwise couldn't. And as we get confidence that an instrument is ready for real investment, we can then work with our partners to put some catalytic capital into those investments and get them off the ground.
But hasn't it taken grant capital to really?
And it has taken a lot of grant resources to
Let's not lose sight of that.
to design those structures, to work with partners, to test what works and what doesn't work, and even to test them in the market.
I'm going to let you look forward now,
Okay,
Carol.
good. Yeah. So, a couple of themes that my fellow panelists have already hit on. One thing that you said, Raj, was for everyone in the room, no matter where you are, what your foundation is, there's a role for you to play here. And you use the word democratize for your donor advisors. And I've been president of the Packard Foundation for 14 years now, and whoa, yeah.
There's hope.
Yeah, that's true. But, in this decade plus, the growth and collaboration among foundations and their grant making has been huge to great positive effect. The Hewlett Foundation and Packard, along with McKnight, started Climate Works, which is this huge global collaboration around, and we could point to many more. You all have been leaders in your foundations around that. So looking forward, we at Packard, and we thank Julie and your leadership at MacArthur, really would like to see more collaboration around use of catalytic capital. Make it easier for all of you, no matter where you are in your foundation and in your journey, to participate in the use of this kind of capital that is a little more risky, but has great leverage possibilities and can catalyze things. So where we're looking forward is, I'll mention a different area of our commitment, which I've mentioned, is climate change. But did you know that agroforestry, forests, sustainable agriculture is like one of the biggest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions? And so Belinda Morris, our program lead here, who works on that area of our grant making, is working very closely with Susan Finney-Silver and people at other foundations who have been involved in global work on sustainable land use and on agroforestry, to see if there isn't a way to set up some sort of a collaborative structure, a fund of funds, that would be able to accept catalytic capital from a number of other donors to really make a difference in terms of creating those conditions that will allow other kinds of capital to flow in. You know, Raj, we worked with you all on Sunfunder, and there's a great report coming out now about just the leverage of that, of us being able to take a position that was more concessionary, but it allowed other people to come in and create this blended capital. Well, we want to do that more, and we see great opportunity with the sustainable land use. So we're down, talk to Susan and Belinda, they're here, and they can tell you who else we're working with on this. But it was Julie, your leadership at MacArthur too, that is really encouraging us to think about how can we, if democratize is the right word, but how can we make it easier for all of us to use this great tool that we have in addition to our grant making.
We haven't talked about one of the things that you're really working hard on, Rip, and that is how can we employ guarantees in the mix?
Well, and in many ways, it's motivated by exactly what Carol has just suggested. I mean, is it possible to create a platform that is actually fairly simple, efficient, and sort of readily operational? One of the things that has been interesting about the whole mission conversation is the idea that we are sitting on balance sheet assets that very few of us put to use, which is our ability to guarantee. And our board set aside a sort of a 10% commitment to social investing, they realized that you needed the $150 million on cash on one side for the PRI work, but they also thought we should carve out $150 million on the guarantee side. And as a result, Kimberly and her team have been looking at a whole suite of sort of customized work, which is important, and you can kind of move it deal by deal and figure out how a guarantee supports that. But she's lately developed a concept called a guarantee bank, in which we might put up the first $25 million. We might be joined, we hope, by other foundations who would sort of pool the guarantees. Those that, let's say it's a $100 million pool, that would then be distributed to a servicer. The servicer would then identify in 3 areas: affordable housing, small business development focused on communities of color, and climate change mitigation and adaptation, and figure out how to move those monies into qualified CDFIs who are working in this space. I mean, it's a very simple instrument. I mean, forgive me, Kimberly, it's going to be really hard to figure out how to do it, but probably. But the broad concept of creating sort of pooled risk so that no individual investor is sort of disproportionately at risk, spreading it across enough domains so that you have sort of coverage of enough disciplinary interest to attract people to the fund, and then sort of see how it goes. I mean, this seems to me something that could be easily scalable, easily explained to others, and might actually get a real take-up if it's done properly.
Christine, what are you looking forward to?
I think the big opportunity for the Denver Foundation, and I would argue for all community foundations, is really this two things. Number one is the engagement of multiple stakeholders. So we sit in a place in our communities where we have these deeply held relationships with our fund holders, with our nonprofits, with other local funders, but also with national funders. And I think that we can be the place that connects those dots in ways that combine the wonderful innovation that's happening at this pretty sophisticated level with the community need, the real community need. And I think it's so important for us to make sure that as we do this work, that we don't get too caught up in our big ideas and forget about what the actual needs are and the real solutions are on the ground. That's where community foundations can play an important and valuable role in this space, because we are in partnership with those folks. We know who the great social innovators are. We know where there is wonderful opportunity if we just had the right capital investment to spur that project and ultimately to maybe scale it or replicate it elsewhere. we've got our ear on the ground, and I think that figuring out how we use those relationships and bring and leverage all of those different types of resources to projects both small and large, that's where we're excited to play.
I'm excited about the potential of partnering with community foundations. As a matter of fact, the $100 million Benefit Chicago site visit that some of you actually took advantage of yesterday is a collaboration between MacArthur, Calvert Impact Capital, and the Chicago Community Trust. So it seems to me that there are ways for foundations that have different perspectives, different worldviews to be brought down to the ground through a relationship with a community foundation in a sophisticated but workable financial arrangement. So I guess I would encourage that kind of exploration across the board. What am I talking to here? So let's do a little sort of real-time experimentation. We had a conversation this morning about opportunity zones, and I know that you two were chatting about the possibilities there.
Raj, please.
Well, you know, as I'm sure everyone in the room knows and has been discussed before, the tax bill included an amendment that allowed governors to designate low-income census tracts in their state as opportunity zones, and then funds that make, qualified funds that make investments in property and businesses that primarily operate in those census tracts that are approved benefit from special tax treatment through this opportunity zones tax legislation. I guess I'd make a couple of points about it. First, I hope everyone here appreciates the extraordinary amount of tax benefit being offered to investors that take advantage of this amendment in the legislation. Basically, you get, if you're in a fund for 10 years or an investment for 10 years, you get a deferral on your capital gains. If you put realized capital gains into the investment, you get a 10-year deferral on paying the capital gains tax. When you do, you get a 15% nominal reduction 10 years out of what that payment liability is. And then for the 10 years that your investment sits in the opportunity zone investment, it grows completely tax-free. And taken together, that is the single biggest tax incentive to invest in lower income communities throughout America that we've seen in the past 100 years. And so this is a room packed with America's top experts in impact investing, and we need you all to help figure this out because a lot of money is about to move into funds that are designated opportunity zone funds. We as a country are making a huge investment. You won't see it as clearly because it comes in the form of tax relief, but we're making a huge investment in moving those resources into those communities. And the grand challenge for impact investing over, I think, the next decade will be ensuring that we work together with communities to make sure that the investments actually lift people up as opposed to displacing them out of those communities. And so RIP has some ideas on how to do that. We at the Rockefeller Foundation are eager to partner with folks who have ideas on how to make that happen. I believe these funds are fundamentally impact investment funds, whether they live up to that statement with data, rigor of understanding what it takes to ensure the benefits of a local investment actually create jobs and opportunity for that local community. That will define whether this big American experiment on impact investing actually yields fruit.
But I
Just a couple of ideas.
just really, ideas, perhaps as
Thoughts.
concerns, yeah. I mean, think how easy this is going to be to go sideways. Big box, slam it in, no community context. And I think Raj is exactly right, that the philanthropic community has a unique perch to try to figure out at multiple levels how to avoid that. Our two foundations are going to release a letter of inquiry to a bunch of fund managers to get their ideas about how they might do something beneficial in low-income communities in combination with some philanthropic tools like guarantees or other risk reduction instruments. We talked this morning about whether we ought not to create some kind of database that would sort of signal when these investments are sort of moving in certain kinds of directions and not other kinds of directions. And it also, I was surprised to learn that any investment between now and 2026 qualifies for this sort of 10-year deferral mechanism. And I think part of our job is to work with local communities to make sure that there's not a rush to judgment. In Detroit, for example, there is no reason we have to jump off the edge and figure out what these investments are going to look like tomorrow. We can work with the municipal sector, we can work with the private sector, and we can do kind of classic good community development to sort of create bumper rails around the kind of projects that we think ultimately will benefit the low-income residents of our communities. So I'm completely with Raj. I think this is huge. I think it could be complex, but I think in this combination of new instruments, data, local community partnership, philanthropy, everybody in this room has a potential role to play. It could be really huge.
What do you think about a role for a community foundation in this mix?
You're not going to be able to get the data unless you invest in the nonprofit organizations that are collecting the data. So I think an important role that community foundations can play is in that capacity building and identification of good potential on-the-ground community partners. But you know, there's a lot of organizations that certainly understand evaluation, but I think what we're seeing is a desire to collect the same data or collect data across, you know, these different investments, and maybe there's some sort of evaluation tool that's going to be necessary, or investment in the people to collect the data or processes, and I think that that's going to be important, so that nonprofit capacity building is a place where I think community foundations can play.
Carol, jump in.
I was just going to say, put a pin in that. We talked a lot this morning, a group of us, about the absence of accountability in the federal legislation and likely in the federal regulations. And so trying to figure out, to this point, what does accountability look like in this kind of complex tax structure? Who holds that accountability? It's, with all due respect, it's probably not going to be this administration. And so how do you actually make sure that the dollars are flowing in ways that ultimately are accountable to community health? Excuse me, Carol, sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just going to tie this with yesterday's plenary.
Yep.
So,
Sparks?
Well, you're wrong.
no, I know, you are. No,
let Carol talk.
No, yeah. I am a middle child, too. But anyway, you know, we had a really great discussion about where can you have the most impact, and is mission investing a place to do that, or is it all grant making? We should be humble about the resources that we have in philanthropy. Who are we to think that even if we deployed all of our billions and hundreds of whatever it is in our endowments, would that make a difference? But this conversation you're all having here is exactly where we, whether it's our grant making or our mission investments, have a chance to affect systems and structures. That tax reform was probably going to be passed without us, right? And it's going to be implemented without us. Some of the money flowing into climate change globally is going to happen without us. What we look for is the opportunity, using the tools that we have, both grant making and catalytic investments, to create the ecosystem to try to really affect those big things that are going to happen without us. Whoops. And to hold us accountable, hold people accountable for it. So it really is. It's going to take grants. Earlier today, Gene Case was talking about nurturing the ecosystem to make sure that impact stays at the center. And it takes grants, it takes lots of players, and using all of our tools. So we can affect structural change and systemic change.
So Raj.
Could I just, I agree with all of that, and it makes me concerned about the pace at which philanthropy sometimes work. I'm really proud to be part of an institution that's been around for 105 years. But you know, we all have to move with real urgency if we want to shape the way this legislation will steer billions of dollars into lower income communities in our country. You know, it passed at the end of December. By April 22nd, every state and territory, with the exception of Guam, had submitted an application. 20 of the applications are basically approved. About 3/4 of the zones in those 20 states are in urban areas, 1/4 in rural areas. The other 20, there are another 22 that are not approved yet, but are publicly available, so you can go and see where the opportunity zones are by going to different websites. The Economic Innovation Group has a particularly useful one for that purpose. Funds are already being created and formed, and rulemaking is happening at the IRS that will govern all of this. And I do hope that we all together can move fast enough to be able to maybe set some standards on accountability, bring the experience of those who have lived empowerment zones and Community Reinvestment Act and other forms of community development and economic incentives to drive those developments to the forefront. Maybe accelerate our own processes if they tend to be slow, I don't know, to get communities more involved in the deal flow and in where the investments are going, and get people skilled and trained at a pace and a speed that can keep up. Because otherwise the alternative is we make this big national investment by giving tax relief to, frankly, people who have quite a lot of wealth and quite a lot of unrealized capital gains. And we see the consequence of that is not lifting up those it is intended to lift up. So I say this to my team all the time. I'd say this to all of you. This is one project that requires real urgency if we're going to be relevant.
So I think you're calling for, let's not be sitting in a room like this in 15 years looking back and saying, how did we miss that? How did we miss the opportunity of all of these incredible investments, all this energy, and not have turned it to the good for the country?
Yeah.
That would be a bad thing, and let's make sure we don't do that. So let's do a 4-minute lightning round. What's your call to action? What's your sense of urgency, not just on the opportunity zones, but for people in the planet and this tool for that?
Well, I'm not sure, I might be preaching to the choir here, but for all of those community foundations that are in the room that are still at those beginning stages, maybe trying to convince your boards that this is a space that community foundations can play, you can do it. We're 5 years in. We've made a lot of progress in terms of developing the right kinds of infrastructure in community foundations. And now for those of you who are newer to this, there's a lot of groundwork that's been laid that you can learn from. So don't just dip your toe in, jump in.
Dive in.
Dive in, and don't be afraid of it. The leverage that community foundations can access in this space to make sure that these investments, whether you're talking about this new opportunity, Raj, or other ones, community foundations can be those important connectors for the projects that really can achieve social impact and advance the missions that we all have. So don't be afraid.
Rip.
The thing that I think unlocked our social investment work at Kresge was the idea that you're aiming at the same thing in everything you do. And I talk to a lot of folks who say, oh, this is so complicated. We don't have the staff. We don't have the partners. We don't have whatever. We don't have a board who will do this. And I think at the end of the day, if you're really clear about what you're trying to accomplish, it's back to Raj's point. It's just, all right, then don't just think of one tool. Think of 3 or 4 or 5 tools. And that can come off your balance sheet, it can come off your PRIs, it can come off your soft skill contributions intellectually. I mean, there are all sorts of ways to do it. And I think once our board sort of got that very simple construct, they were all in, saying, all right, if we're trying to reduce health disparities in low-income communities, of course, we would use all of these tools and go for it. I think, how to kind of get comfortable with some of this, I think, is simply just finding some partners. I mean, get some folks who have done this, call them up, visit with them, look on a website. I mean, I think there are ways to get started that don't sort of get you so far out over your skis that it becomes a problem for your board and staff.
I'm going to go to Raj because, Carol, I want you to have the last word.
All right.
I guess I have the same set of comments. I think most people, most capital resides in institutions and endowments and pools, pension funds, where there are very strict fiduciary responsibilities. And for those pools of capital, getting on the impact investment bandwagon and learning how to make sure that your participation in meeting your fiduciary duty also helps to advance society, as we need you to do that. We need you to do that with rigor and tools, and this whole conference has been such an important opportunity for me to see how far the field has come, but also how much farther there is to go to be really rigorous about the data that underpins what success could look like. I'd say for those with catalytic capital, as Julie has pointed out, and you have the ability to take a loss or to use your money in grant form to do, you have the capacity to take even bigger risks and use your capital to put together financial structures that can attract more commercial money, as you've seen in Detroit and so many other examples. And so that's the requirement. And then I have one important point for those who are not sitting on a big pool of capital, which is a lot of people. At the end of the day, policy has always determined the nature of whether our capitalism in this country and around the world serves our full population. And I happen to think this Opportunity Zones legislation is one important policy that we need to engage in as a community to expand the reach of opportunity in our country. But there are others, and I would just encourage all of you to be cognizant of that point and not to think that good intentions in investment alone is capable of changing the fact that if you were born a poor kid in a family in America in the 1950s or 1960s, you had a greater than 50% chance of moving into the middle class as you grew up. If you're that same kid born today, you have a less than 25% chance. That's not the path we want to be on as a country. And I would urge you to use impact investing, catalytic capital, or just your voice as strong advocates on behalf of those who have less to lift everybody up.
Carol.
Well, and
Last word.
Yeah, thank you. Leave here with a sense of urgency and opportunity. Raj, your voice on this panel and all of you, the urgency of the moment, the time we're in, we should have a sense of urgency and opportunity. The second, don't go it alone. That means pay attention to what your colleagues are doing, work with community foundations, work with some of the funds we're all hoping to set up. Come to MIE conferences and support MIE. And third is keep impact at the center. I mean, that's why we're convened. It's what we care about. And no matter what field we're working in, that's our role, keeping impact at the center.
So join me in thanking this terrific panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Julia and the panel for that very engaging conversation, highlighting the tremendous leverage that foundations can achieve. You provided real concrete examples, both past and future, that I hope others in the room can take action on and bring back to their own communities to drive impact. So thank you again to the panel. Some very quick announcements before we set you off on the afternoon. We have breakout sessions coming up, followed by 3 mini plenaries. I then hope you will all join us at tonight's reception, the Chicago Skyline presented by Northern Trust. We will bring a bit of Chicago to you here in the hotel, including the artistic talents of some high school students from the After School Matters program. So please join us at 6 p.m. in the Looking Glass Ballroom on the 3rd floor, and we will be in a suite of rooms overlooking the river. It should be a lovely evening. Thanks again to Northern Trust, and we'll see you all then. Thanks so much.